Welcome to the Federal Regulatory Update. I would like to thank the Governor's Office of Economic Development for the invitation today. My name is Sharon Bertelsen. I'm a communications attorney at Ballard Spahr. Prior to joining Ballard, I spent 15 years at the Federal Communications Commission in Washington, D.C., where I spent most of my time in broadcast and wireless services. I should point out that my views are not the views of my firm or any of my clients. Today, I will be talking about incentive auctions, the FCC's 600 megahertz band plan, the FCC's open internet rules, and privacy protections, all of which are very important to the future of wireless broadband. So what is an incentive auction? It's a voluntary, market-based means for repurposing spectrum. It involves two different auctions. The first is an auction by the broadcasters of their spectrum use rights. The second is an auction of those rights that the FCC acquires through the first auction to providers of wireless broadband services. Congress in 2012 passed the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act, the Spectrum Act is what we call it, authorizing the FCC to conduct incentive auctions. The auction is organized in a series of stages. The first stage of the auction will consist of a reverse auction to determine the amount of compensation each broadcast television licensee would accept in return for relinquishing their spectrum rights. And then there's a forward auction. Within each auction, there will be rounds of bidding. And in each round of bidding, the purchase price will either decline in the case of the reverse auction or go up in the case of a forward auction. The FCC will set an initial clearing target, and they're going to do that by announcing the high opening bidding prices, and they're going to see which broadcasters register for the auction. The FCC will then decide, based on the level of participation, how much spectrum they will seek to buy from the broadcasters, and therefore how much spectrum they will have to auction it in the forward stage of the auction. The FCC has something called the final stage rule, which will determine when the auction closes, whether the FCC has recouped enough money to pay the broadcasters and then also cover the auction expenses. A lot of focus has been on this incentive auction and the broadcaster's option to relinquish their channel at the auction at the beginning. However, Congress actually required three different options for broadcasters in the Spectrum Act. Number one, the broadcasters could get into the reverse auction and relinquish their spectrum, give the FCC their 6 megahertz channel, go dark, and receive their compensation, and that's it. The second option is a channel sharing option. The third option is moving from a UHF, ultra high frequency channel, to a VHF, very high frequency channel. Under the channel sharing option, a broadcaster would relinquish its existing 6 megahertz channel in the reverse auction, but instead of going off the air, they remain a licensee, they remain on the air, and then they share a channel with another broadcaster. For example, before the auction, these channels are separately licensed. They're both 6 megahertz channels. And then in a channel sharing arrangement, the licensee on channel 49 would relinquish in the reverse auction their 6 megahertz and then move to the channel sharing arrangement with channel 21. Now, it's not exactly dividing up a 6 megahertz channel 3 and 3. It's more of an allocation of capacity in this shared channel arrangement, and it's all subject to agreement between the parties. So for example, one licensee may have a sporting event needing more capacity, and the other may be running a talk show at the same time needing less capacity. So they can work it out, and the agreement would include financial, operational, and technical arrangements between the parties. From the FCC's point of view, channel sharing is identical to complete relinquishment because it means that one full licensed 6 megahertz channel is given back, but instead of going off the air, the licensee is keeping the license and porting over to the other channel. The licensee receives payment, although that licensee might need to share some of the proceeds with the channel sharing partner, in this case, channel 21. The broadcaster has up to 3 months after it receives the proceeds to cease operations on its pre-auction channel. And there's been a lot of interest in this option, especially with public broadcasters and broadcasters who have the commonly owned stations in the same market. They've also done a lot of trials which demonstrate that the feasibility of channel sharing from a technical standpoint works very well. And as we all know, technology improves in the future. So this may be a very good option. The third option, it's actually third and fourth option, is moving from, broadcasters can move from UHF to VHF or high VHF to low VHF. So there are options within this option. The benefit of the broadcaster would be similar to channel sharing, but the payment is a little different. Here, the broadcaster tenders the 6 megahertz channel, and the FCC would have that spectrum for repurposing, but instead of paying the broadcaster in cash, the FCC provides a combination of cash and another 6 megahertz channel that is in the VHF band. This option allows the broadcasters to stay on the air, tender the spectrum for payment, and then also receive this other channel. Broadcasters in this case have up to 39 months after the incentive auction ends to move to the new channel. So once the FCC has determined which broadcasters are going to participate and which broadcasters are going to remain on the air, those that do not participate or those that entered into the auction at the beginning but ultimately dropped out because the price wasn't right or the FCC was offering a price that was too low for their interest, the FCC then has to repack these broadcasters into a smaller portion of the band. The essence of the auction is really to take these UHF channels, the stations, across the band from channel 21 to 51, buy as many as the FCC needs in each market to create this contiguous block of spectrum for re-auction, and then repack the remaining stations in a smaller portion of the 600 megahertz band, which is where the broadcasters are today, so that all broadcasters who elect to remain on the air can do so without any change in their coverage area or their population served. For example, the FCC could take a station that's on channel 50, since it's in the upper portion of the band, it's almost certainly going to be part of the reconfigured 600 megahertz band that would be cleared for wireless broadband. And the FCC would have to move that channel 50 down band to a lower channel, such as channel 21. And to summarize, the FCC relocates the station, preserves the population served, preserves the coverage area, and replicates the service contour with no greater interference than it had at its original channel. And when I say locate, I don't mean geographically locate. I mean locating lower in the band. So following the repacking process, how will the FCC rearrange the 600 megahertz band? The FCC settled on a down from 51 plan, which means starting from channel 51, which is the highest UHF channel right now, and moving down from 51, the FCC will take the spectrum that was reclaimed and allocate it into paired blocks, an uplink and a downlink block, which enables the two-way communications. And then they would auction these together. So 2 5 megahertz blocks, a total of 10 megahertz, would be auctioned in the forward auction. The FCC adopted a flexible design because they don't really know how many broadcasters are going to participate and tender their spectrum. The band plan can accommodate variations in the amount of spectrum recovered in the different geographic areas. To give you a sense of how the band plan will look, I provided an example here. And this is an example where the FCC was able to reclaim 72 megahertz from broadcasters. And there's the band plan. In this case, it starts on the right hand and moves down. So right on this edge is the 700 megahertz uplink. Depending on how much the spectrum the FCC gets, this will be different. But in this example, if the FCC reclaims 72 megahertz from broadcasters, so that's 12 blocks, 6 megahertz each, 12 channels, the FCC could refigure the band in a way depicted here. And there would be an 11 megahertz duplex gap and an 11 megahertz guard band, right here. As far as the post-auction transition, for those broadcasters who elect not to participate in the auction or who are not chosen, they will have up to 39 months to move their new channel. For broadcasters who are chosen in the auction, they have up to 3 months to get off the air after they get their money. Also, Congress created a TV broadcaster relocation reimbursement fund of $1.75 billion. For licensees who are reassigned to new channels, this fund will reimburse them for equipment that they need to move from a higher channel to a lower channel. So where is the FCC in this process? Actually, they're right in the pre-auction part of the process. In May 2014, the FCC adopted a report and order establishing the general rules and procedures for conducting the incentive auction. In July, after a rulemaking process, they adopted competitive bidding procedures. This year, the FCC released an information packet for broadcasters, and there have been a series. There have been many FCC webinars on various auction-related matters, and there have also been information sessions conducted in cities across the country. And they're also getting ready, technically, those stations that are eligible for protection in the repacking process, all of those stations have submitted technical certification forms to confirm the correctness of their technical parameters in the FCC database. The FCC has also initiated a number of proceedings that address other issues such as interference standard. And then recently, in August, the FCC released a public notice with procedures for setting the initial spectrum clearing target, qualifying to bid, and bidding in the reverse and forward auctions. The auction is scheduled to begin on March 29th.
Thank you, Sharon. That was excellent. My name is Douglas Meredith. I work for Stauralakis Incorporated. We're a management consulting firm for rural telephone companies around the country. I happen to live in just north of Salt Lake City in Bountiful. Spent quite a bit of time in D.C., about 13, 14 years, and so that's where I'm coming from. I'm an economist. I'm not a lawyer. And what I want to do is one just little postscript on this issue, the excellent material that you just received. You might be saying, why are we interested in this? Well, the 600 megahertz spectrum is Superman spectrum. It has excellent propagation, and it's going to be used for broadband. And so that's why the FCC is going through all of this effort to relocate, essentially, television channels. Broadcasters have those rights, have those licenses. They're relocating those providers to other parts of the radio spectrum so that they can then sell extremely high-value property, and that property is that 600 megahertz range. The Superman spectrum is no lie. Television signals go leap tall buildings and go through cement and concrete very nicely. And so that's why it's very, very important to keep your eye on that. What I want to talk to you for the next, we're tag teaming here, and so what I want to talk to you about in two items, but I want to talk about unlicensed spectrum. To participate in auctions, you have to have quite a bit of money because of the auction pricing and all of that. But in this particular case, Wi-Fi policy, or using the 802.11 standard, is quite useful, and the FCC is doing quite a bit with the Wi-Fi policy. The FCC has new approaches to broadband. They want to, quote, advance new strategies to connect U.S. consumers to world-leading wired and wireless broadband networks. In a sense, you can think of the FCC as being agnostic on what type of technology is used to deliver broadband. They don't care if it's fiber. They don't care if it's wireless. They just want, actually, consumers to get broadband services to their location that they prefer. And so they have this dual path, not only broadband wireline, but also, or landline, but also broadband wireless. And really a lot of the action, and I think Sharon would agree with me, a lot of the action, the exciting action, is both in the licensed spectrum and in the unlicensed spectrum. You might have a couple of these items in your house. The top two are usually used. You know, you have this a Wi-Fi router that is connected to either a cable modem or a DSL connection, and it provides Wi-Fi signal throughout your house so that devices, tablets, computers, DVD players, smart televisions all can connect to the internet. And in this particular case, this ASUS router with it looks like 6 antennas is the state of the art. It's 802.11 AC. AC is the new standard, and they're in their second wave. It's wave 2 of that. If you don't have 802.11 AC, or you haven't looked at your router at your home for a while, you might want to invest in one of these babies, $100 to $200. And you will have exceptionally much better coverage and much better signal strength with this type of device. The lower devices you may not know about. These are weatherized devices for outdoor use. And that's the important thing about that is in the FCC this last year, in February, released 100 megahertz in the 5.1 gigahertz band for high-powered 1-watt outdoor Wi-Fi equipment. Since before that time, Wi-Fi was never licensed for outdoor use. It was all indoor. And so they said, we're going to actually allow for 1-watt outdoor Wi-Fi equipment. Your Wi-Fi device right now in your house is about 50 milliwatts. And these particular devices that are now licensed will allow to have 1,000 or 1,000 milliwatts or 1 watt. So the coverage is going to be much better. And from a school, from a community, from an anchor institution viewpoint, you know, we have communities across the country that are now deploying these types of devices, these outdoor weatherized devices at 1 watt, and they're providing nearly ubiquitous coverage in communities, because they're able to deliver quite a bit of they'll be able to have quite a bit of coverage for that for those devices. The 802.11 AC standard Wave 2 is standard material now. You can buy it off the shelf at any Best Buy for home use, and a commercial grade is also available, weatherized and commercial grade equipment. This particular Wi-Fi standard AC is really kind of a carrier grade Wi-Fi because it's a 1 gigabit. It's actually 1.3 gigabits per second delivery. And so we're seeing lots of people installing Wi-Fi hotspots for value-added benefit to customers, particularly cable companies. Comcast, for example, has announced several years ago and is deploying Wi-Fi hotspots so that a cable Comcast customer can go out into their community and they can still have connection to a cable Comcast Wi-Fi hotspot and actually get value added for their subscription to cable services, to Comcast services. And so it provides quite a bit of stickiness for the customer. And so the concept that I want to leave with you in just these couple minutes on the Wi-Fi policy is that increasing access will greatly accelerate the advances of Wi-Fi speeds at the 1 gigabit range, as well as reduce congestion. And the 5 gigahertz range is tailor-made for the next generation Wi-Fi. And the FCC has not only announced this extension, this actually outdoor use of Wi-Fi, but they've also said more is coming. So at the 5.1 gigahertz range, they are actually planning to actually release even more broadband spectrum. Unlicensed, but it's used for Wi-Fi. It's for consumers to use and for providers to use. When we look at Wi-Fi, you can think, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, Wi-Fi is everywhere, and Wi-Fi powers the majority, or will power the majority of internet traffic. Because when you have a tablet or a smartphone that's in a Wi-Fi hotspot, the device is smart enough to move to that network rather than using the LTE high value and high cost LTE band. And so all devices most families use every day rely on Wi-Fi. And the Internet of Things that I'll talk about in a little bit is that not only will devices that we use talk, but the devices themselves will talk to each other in this concept of the Internet of Things. Now, I do want to talk just briefly about Federal Universal Service and give you a small 3-minute update on what Universal Service is doing for, at the FCC. Universal service is this concept of providing support or subsidy, however you want to describe it, support for high-cost areas. So essentially what happens is the Federal Universal Service surcharge that you have on your phone bill or wireless mobile phone bill goes into a fund that is then distributed to carriers that are high cost. These are fairly remote, high cost areas, rural areas that it's very expensive to serve. For many, many years, it's been operating for voice only. And now the goals of the Connect America Fund, which is now the new named program the FCC has for Universal Service, is to preserve voice service but also expand into broadband. And so the FCC is now shifting, they're pivoting and shifting their policies to actually include explicit support for broadband support for rural communities, and there are a number of rural carriers in the state of Utah that receive money from these programs. They can use them for voice and broadband service. And the rest of the goals ensure the availability of modern networks, et cetera. There's lots of goals, but the one takeaway that I want you to take from Universal Service is that there are federal programs, Universal Service programs, that are directing their efforts to goals that include broadband delivery and broadband deployment.
By that you mean money?
Yes, money. Yes, funds. Yes, operational CapEx recovery and operational expense recovery. Yes, these funds are money that are distributed to providers for to recover operational costs. Yes. So now we'll move to another subject.
Okay, as we all know, an open internet means that consumers can go where they want, when they want, and they can send what they want to people that they want to send it to. So this principle is also called net neutrality. On February 26th, 2015, this year, the FCC adopted in a 3-2 decision new open internet rules that are designed to protect free expression and innovation on the internet and promote investment in broadband networks. The new open internet rules went into effect on June 12, 2015, and they apply to both fixed and mobile broadband services. The FCC established 3 bright line rules that prohibit practices that are known to harm the internet. Number 1, no blocking. Broadband providers may not block access to legal content, applications, services, or non-harmful devices. Number 2, no throttling. Broadband providers may not impair lawful internet traffic on the basis of content, applications, services, or non-harmful devices. And 3, no paid prioritization. Broadband providers may not favor some lawful internet traffic over other lawful internet traffic in exchange for consideration, or in other words, no fast lanes. To protect against similar harms from practices that fall outside of these 3 bright line rules, the FCC established kind of a legal standard under which it will prohibit practices on a case-by-case basis that unreasonably interfere with or disadvantage the ability of consumers to access the internet. In the Open Internet Order, the FCC adopted enhancements to the existing transparency rule, covering disclosures by broadband service providers, including just commercial terms for prices, data cap allowances, and notice of network management practices that affect service. The FCC's efforts to regulate the internet are controversial because many believe that the FCC is stretching its statutory authority, and its previous two attempts at regulating the internet were overturned in court. Under the Communications Act of 1934, as amended by the Telecommunications Act of 1996, Congress charged the FCC with regulating specific types of regulations, or specific types of communication services. Telecommunication services, or telephones, two-way telephones, are regulated under Title II of the Act. Broadcast TV, radio, and commercial radio, mobile radio services fall under Title III, and cable television falls under Title VI of the Communications Act. As legal authority, the FCC Open Internet Order relied on Title II of the Communications Act and Section 706 of the Telecom Act of 1996. The FCC reclassified broadband internet access service as a telecommunications service that is subject to the requirements of Title II, and further declared mobile internet access to be a commercial mobile service. As part of the decision, the FCC also refrains or forbears from enforcing provisions of Title II that are not relevant to broadband service. According to the FCC, the net neutrality rules encourage broadband deployment as Congress directed in Section 706. So there's no shortage of opinion on this issue. The FCC received in this rulemaking over 4 million comments, and President Obama also gave his opinion. And this was in November of last year. President Obama called for the FCC to reclassify broadband as a telecommunications service and to impose open internet protections based on that classification. Title II is the same regulatory classification of basic telephone service, which traditionally has been heavily regulated. Many are concerned that if ISPs are subjected to FCC oversight under Title II, they may be less inclined to invest in expanding their capacity or reaching out to underserved areas. After the Open Internet Order, attention moved to the appellate courts. As you could imagine, various parties filed petitions for review in different courts, and then the challenges were all transferred to the DC Circuit. There are also discussions of possible legislative solutions. There have been House and Senate committee hearings on draft legislation that would prohibit ISPs from blocking, throttling, and paid prioritization, and also legislation that would limit the FCC's role in regulating the internet. On top of all of this, in January 2017, maybe there will be a new party that takes control of the White House and thus the FCC. So we're likely that we likely have not heard the last word on this issue. The FCC's Open Internet Order also, when it classified broadband service as a Title II service, it reclassified them as a common carrier. And in the order, the FCC stated that Section 222 of the Communications Act applies to broadband internet access service providers. And this has to do with broadband consumer privacy. So among other protections, Section 222 imposes a duty on every telecommunications carrier to protect the confidentiality of its consumers' private information. and it imposes restrictions on a carrier's ability to use, disclose, or permit access to what is CPNI, Customer Proprietary Network Information, without their consent. In the order, the FCC forbears from applying the current FCC rules, CPNI rules that apply to telephones, because they were specifically written for voice services, and they're not well suited to broadband internet access service. More recently, on May 20th, 2015, the FCC Enforcement Bureau issued an enforcement advisory concerning the privacy practices of internet service providers. The advisory informed all broadband providers that the FCC's open internet order applies the core customer privacy protections of Section 222, and that Section 222 privacy protections will be enforced after the June 12, 2015 date that the FCC's net neutrality rules become effective. But before, the FCC actually has a separate rulemaking proceeding to determine how Section 222 will apply to broadband. So there we have this interim period, and broadband providers are expected to comply with Section 222 and take good faith steps to employ effective privacy protections, but it's a little vague. And recognizing that the FCC gave little guidance about the conduct on or privacy practices, the FCC extended in that advisory and offer to help. So if broadband providers have questions about what is reasonable, the Enforcement Bureau will provide informal and formal guidance. Now we have the Federal Trade Commission. Because they enforce online consumer privacy protections, there is a little known provision in the Federal Trade Commission law called the Common Carrier Exemption, which gives the FCC exclusive authority over telephone services. Now that ISPs are considered common carriers, they could be out of reach of the Federal Trade Commission's enforcement. Many of the privacy and data security cases today stem from online and mobile practices. And one of the Federal Trade Commission commissioners has publicly stated that she is very worried about the Federal Trade Commission's ability to enforce its longstanding online consumer privacy protections following the FCC's open internet order. She is concerned that broadband providers will be out of the FTC's reach and will instead face privacy regulation and enforcement from the less experienced FCC. So please stay tuned. I do know, and I've seen, it appears that the FCC and the FTC are working together on this issue.
Thank you. Excellent material. The net neutrality issue, just a postscript, everybody's going ape crazy on that. I mean, they are very, very agitated. Lots of different things going on, and I think oral argument in the federal U.S. Court of Appeals District of Columbia Circuit is scheduled for November. So you'll hear more above the fold on A1 if you ever read any newspapers anymore. That's where it'll be. Now, we've been talking about federal regulation, and really the key and really the marquee items for this year. And I wanted to step back and give you a sense as to why the FCC is doing all of this. And we really want to talk about future demand and future Wi-Fi demand in particular, what will be at the market. And I want to address three different areas to give you kind of that's what this is all about in the future, and this is why the FCC is trying to set up a situation where there's plenty of spectrum and there's plenty of rights and there's plenty of openness in the broadband space. Let me walk you through home entertainment, home intelligence, and then personal networks and wearables, and where this is going and how it fits into both Wi-Fi and also licensed spectrum. First of all, home entertainment. You probably all have flat screen TVs at home. You went out and bought the new 1080p or I machine or TV a couple years ago, and you said, this is the best thing since sliced bread, and I won't ever have to replace my TV for many, many years. Well, guess what? You need to replace your TV, because now what's on the market is it's already arrived in the market, available at your Costco or other discount store, is a 4K display TV. That is the wonder kid of television broadcasting and movie broadcasting as well. And so what happens here is the 4K standard is being adopted. It's not just a pixel war. We're not just increasing pixels to get more pixels. But the 4K standard actually has better color, higher contrast, better sound, and improved compression. That means that delivery over a broadband network is improved with a 4K standard as opposed to a standard HD standard. The picture you see here on the screen is you have your standard definition television. These are pixels. This is to scale. So you have 720 by 480. HD is 1920 by 1080, and so when you go out and buy a 1080p TV, it's a 1080 pixels on the vertical axis, and it's progressively interlaced, but we don't have to get into that. It's to 920 by 1080. 4K is 4 times that. It's 4 HD TVs as far as pixel size. It's 4 times your HD. You could actually technically have 4 different, if you want a multi-channel. Multitasking is the bane of existence, but if you want a multi-channel, you could have 4 HD TV channels on one 4K display. And then just to be technicals for those in the audience that would want to call me on it, 4K is really 3,840. It's really not technically 4K. To get 4K, you have to go to the cinema, because the cinema 4K is 4,096. There's just a little bit of extra for it, so you can pay $19 to go see something in the movie theater. Okay, so the timeline for this, the TVs are out, and there's a little bit of broadcast that's coming out 4K, but in 2016, 18, 2020, depends on who you talk to, most of the programming will be in a 4K format, which will give a most exceptional immersive experience. This is what TV is. Now, how much, you're going to say, pray tell, how much broadband speed do I need in order to get a streamed 4K signal into my house? Well, it's going to be, right now, it's about 20 to 25 megabits per second. Okay? So to deliver a true 4K that doesn't compromise, you're at that particular standard. So if you have 1 or 2 4K TVs running in your house, you can see that the consumer demand far exceeds 50 megabits per second on a delivery system. Okay? And so that's what home entertainment is, in addition to everything else that's going on. As far as home intelligence go, more items in the home will be intelligent. You have light bulbs, you have thermostats, you have ovens that you can control with a smartphone device. All of these, appliances, furniture, and even automobiles. You've heard about autonomous vehicles. Tesla and Google are at the forefront of that, but all of the manufacturers are working on intelligent automobile technology. And if you want more about that, you probably should be in Tara's presentation in this hour, because she's talking about intelligent or autonomous vehicles in roads. But all of these devices are usually ad hoc right now. There's not a standard technology or standard profile or platform for all of this to work. But have no worries, it's being worked on. Home hubs to interconnect and communicate with all these devices will most likely reside in your pocket on your smartphone, and you'll be able to capture information and transmit information from all different things in your home. Thermostats right now, the Nest thermostat that was bought by Google for billions of dollars. You're saying, why would they want to buy a thermostat company for billions of dollars? Well, it's because Nest had a really great product that delivered intelligence into the home, and that can be actually extracted from the home as well. As far as personal networks go, the goal is to harness the power of the smartphone. And it's to eventually not have you bring your phone out of your pocket. On average, people will bring their smartphone out of their pocket 100 times a day. Looking at the time, looking at whatever, 100 times a day. And this pocket grab is to be avoided. And so what's happening is not only in the Wi-Fi space, there's also a standard, it's a Bluetooth standard, low energy Bluetooth, where devices, personal devices, can actually communicate with the central processing unit, which is this phone that is super powerful. And you'll have devices like smartwatches, you'll have devices like goggles, and these misfits. These goggles are quite interesting. These are ski goggles. You put it on, on the screen, you're able to see your speed, your descent, your trail. All of that is presented on the screen as you're going down the hill. The holy grail of goggles is swim goggles for long-distance swimmers, because long-distance swimmers need to pace themselves, and if you had a goggle that had intelligent information, it would greatly improve the swimmer's ability. And then the watches, depending on what you want, what vendor you are, this is all first generation kind of proto technology. Even the Apple Watch and the Moto 360 that are displayed here, these are all first generation. They're just going to get better and better as things go on. And then Misfit is a device that is a fitness device. In addition, you've got the transporter item, which is a personal cloud. If you don't like the NSA in China grabbing all your information off of Dropbox, you can actually set up your own personal cloud for very inexpensively. A couple of transporter devices like this, they are cloud connected, they're synced, and they provide redundancy, and it's a personal cloud, that you can have yourself, and it's encrypted, and so there's no way that anybody can hack it. This item on the right-hand side, on the upper right-hand side, is a ring. It's an NFC ring that will allow you, if it's a proximity ring, so you can actually enter a door or unlock a door just because you have the ring on your person. And then Google Glass. I don't know if anybody has seen Google Glass in the wild. There was a problem with Google Glass that you had this distracted. If you were ever talking to somebody with Google Glass, they'd be looking up, reading your resume, and so they wouldn't be interacting with you very well. And this is distracted eye syndrome. Well, the solution is just to make them sunglasses. Then you're okay, because then people don't see the distracted eye syndrome. But all of these use a Wi-Fi or various forms of technology in order to deliver what consumers are essentially wanting right now. So when we talk about the future, what does it hold? And welcome to the information age. We have broadband demand, and it's really two-pronged. You have wireless adoption and you have wireline adoption, and they can be together as dual use, or they could be exclusive. Depends on what the consumer wants and what the consumer can reach. And then you have wireless data and wireline data. Most of the time, the wireless data, if it's on an LTE network, will be more expensive. And so that's why Wi-Fi and getting it to fiber as fast as possible is the key. And this is the concept of the wireless carriers. You may have heard of VoLTE. It's voice over LTE. It's actually pronounced volte, kind of French-like, but that's how it is, and that's voice over LTE. And so what happens there is that the wireless companies are moving to say, okay, we'll initiate the call, the telecommunications call, on the very expensive spectrum, but then once on the phone side, on the voice side, but we'll move it to packet technology as fast as possible, and then eventually to Wi-Fi technology as fast as possible to get it off the expensive licensed spectrum that Sharon talked about. And so a glimpse of the future is that all of this, even television broadcasting, is going to an over-the-top scenario, where everything is delivered through either a broadband pipe or through a very high-bit throughput wireless connection to the home. And you have over-the-top delivery of video, you have cloud content, you have social networks and electronic commerce, all orbiting around this future concept of broadband. Broadband is the future. And that's why all of the federal regulatory policies that you're seeing coming out of the FCC have a dimension of broadband. They have a particular flavor and bias toward broadband because the FCC sees this. And they want to prepare for the future so that consumers can receive what they want. And that is what we have prepared. Now we're able to take some questions. We have a few minutes to answer any questions that you may have about the federal regulatory process, or Wi-Fi, or whatever, or the Cubs. Yay, go Cubs. They win in Wrigley Field. Yeah. Any questions?
Mr. Windhauser indicated there was a unique opportunity existing in Congress that allowed for spectrum reallocation in a bipartisan manner because the dollars or the economics, if you will, were not having to go in this schema, we're not having to go through the OMB. So his comment personally was that this was kind of an exciting prospect with regard to the type of people assembled here in this conference. Are you aware of that, and do you have any comment?
Well, let me comment and then have Sharon comment on the wireless spectrum. The wireless spectrum is very valuable, and so when the FCC actually auctions it, they actually generate money from the Treasury. You know, they actually bring money in, and so from a bipartisan standpoint, this is actually revenue received rather than revenue expended.
Which is what he was saying would be going outside of that normal process.
He may be talking about the incentive auction. I don't know, Sharon, if you have any other thoughts on that.
No, he didn't use the word auction.
Yeah, yeah,
But anyway, I'm sorry.
yeah. Question back there.
So this is John.
Oh, go ahead. Yes, yes. Clarify, please.
So there's a bill in Congress that Congresswoman Eshoo introduced that would allow federal agencies to benefit if they relinquish their spectrum, and it's for auction in the commercial marketplace, that those federal agencies would get some of the benefit financially from that. So it's not law yet, it's a bill that's been introduced, but there seems to be some support for it.
Yes, and well, let me comment on that particular item. I do have a comment because President Obama actually directed all the federal agencies to look at their spectrum. And if you go into depth on the spectrum sharing, they actually, in the 3.5 gigahertz range, they created a kind of an innovation sandbox to actually figure all this out. And one of the key items in that development was that the Department of Defense gave up spectrum so that it could be repurposed. And when you have the Department of Defense giving up turf, that's a big deal. It's a really big deal. They would never do that unless they were directed by the White House to say if you don't need it. Now this spectrum was for coastal radar and coastal navigation, so they really didn't need to use it in Oklahoma. And so that's one of the reasons why, because it was just coastal bands that they needed to worry about. But so there is an incentive. There is a directive by the White House, and here in Congress there's an interest to actually make sure that departments and divisions of the federal government release spectrum that they're not using or repurpose the spectrum so that it can be used for essentially, the goal is to get it to broadband, some commercial broadband use.
Is there a bill number yet, John? Do you know?
There is a bill number, I can look it up.
Oh,
Yeah.
thanks.
Great. Other questions or comments? Very good. If there are none, thank you very much for your attention and for staying for the last segment. Thank you.